Welcome to This Explainer. As a church history scholar, I literally cannot wait to dive into this one with you. Today, we're jumping right into a formal debate analysis of a fascinating, centuries-old theological dispute, the 4th century Arian heresy versus Orthodox theology. We're going to look at the specific biblical texts, do a really cool linguistic deep dive into the original Greek, and apply some hard logic to analyze the identity of Jesus of Nazareth. Specifically, we're tackling the big question: is he a created being or the eternal creator? Okay, so here is the roadmap for today's explainer. We're mapping this debate out in 5 distinct steps. 1. Arianism versus Orthodox theology. 2. The meaning of Prototokos. 3. The logic of the creator. 4. The translation controversy. And finally, 5. Why this distinction actually matters. All right, let's jump straight into section 1. Arianism versus Orthodox theology, the historical divide. To really understand this, we need to set the historical stage. This is a debate that kicked off way back in the 4th century with a movement called Arianism. But here's the thing, it still actively surfaces in modern theology today, most famously in the teachings of groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses. And as you can see, there is a massive contrast between these two views. On the left, the Arian view asserts that Jesus actually had a beginning. They argue he's a created being, often identified by modern proponents as Michael the Archangel, essentially the very first thing God ever made. Now, on the right, we have the historical Orthodox position, which firmly asserts that Jesus is the co-eternal God, existing without a beginning, completely uncreated. It's a stark, binary choice, and as we'll see, it has massive implications. Moving right along to section 2, the meaning of Prototokos, a linguistic deep dive. So the ultimate textual battleground for this intense debate almost always centers on a single verse, Colossians 1:15. This verse explicitly calls Jesus the firstborn of all creation. Now, when you or I read a modern English translation plainly, we naturally have to ask, does the term firstborn literally mean he was the very first creation? Think about it. If I tell you someone is my firstborn, your mind immediately goes to birth order, right? You think of chronology. And historically speaking, this chronological assumption is exactly where the modern Arian objection gains all of its traction. But to actually solve this puzzle, we have to do a little linguistic deep dive into the original Greek term the Apostle Paul used here, which is prototokos. Now, while it can technically mean first out of the womb, we have to look at the 1st century Jewish and biblical context. In that context, prototokos overwhelmingly defines position. It's used as a title of supreme rank, authority, and inheritance. Basically, it means the one who holds preeminence, not necessarily the guy who was born first. The Old Testament actually illustrates this point brilliantly, specifically when we look at King David. Now, David was famously the youngest of Jesse's 8 sons, literally the chronological lastborn of the family. Yet in Psalm 89:27, God explicitly designates him as firstborn to indicate his supreme, elevated rank as the highest of the kings of the earth. The title has absolutely everything to do with his position and zero to do with his birth order. We see another incredibly powerful example of this in Exodus 4:22, where God calls the entire nation of Israel his firstborn son. Now, chronologically speaking, Israel was definitely not the first nation to exist historically. Empires like Egypt and Babylon were much, much older. Yet, Israel was given the title of Prototokos to show their preeminence and chosen status. So when we apply this linguistic framework back to Colossians, calling Jesus the firstborn of all creation designates him as the supreme ruler and heir over creation, not a created piece of it. Okay, let's head into section 3, logic of the creator, evaluating the evidence. Understanding Prototokos as a title of supremacy, rather than just a chronological birth order, leads us directly into our next logical argument regarding the origins of the entire universe. This brings us to the concept of ex nihilo. That's Latin for out of nothing. Historically, Orthodox Christianity teaches that God spoke reality into existence out of absolutely nothing, without using any pre-existing materials. This points us right to Colossians 1:16, which emphatically states that all things were created by Jesus. In this view, he is the agent of this ex nihilo creation. Based on John 1:3, which states, apart from him not even one thing came into being that has come into being, reality gets categorized strictly into 2 very distinct boxes. Over in category 1, we have the uncreated creator, the eternal word, existing before time and matter ever did. And then, over in category 2, we have creation, absolutely everything that came into being. So, the absolutely crucial point here is a logical impossibility. If Jesus created all things that were created, well, he logically cannot be one of the things that was created. To put it simply, a created being cannot create the very category of all things without absurdly having to create himself before he even existed. There's just no way around it. Therefore, under this logical framework, Jesus must belong firmly in the category of the uncreated creator. And that brings us to section 4, the translation controversy, adding to the text. Because that logic is so airtight, it brings us to a really major controversy in certain modern translations. Specifically, let's examine how some alter the text of Colossians 1:16 to try and bypass this logic entirely. Take the New World Translation, which is used by Jehovah's Witnesses. It actually inserts the word other into the biblical text. So instead of saying Jesus created all things, it reads, by means of him all other things were created. That single added word completely changes the meaning to suggest that God created Jesus first, and then Jesus created all the other things. Now, as a scholar, I have to point out that the pushback here from the academic community is severe. The Greek word for other, which is allos, is completely absent from the original Greek manuscript of Colossians 1:16. It's literally just not there. The text simply says tapanta, meaning all things. This insertion of the word other is seen as a clear case of theology driving the translation. It's widely criticized by language scholars as an intellectually dishonest move to protect an Arian viewpoint. Finally, section 5, why the distinction matters, theological stakes. So, why are we talking about this? Well, the theological stakes of this debate are incredibly high. This isn't just some dried academic dispute over ancient Greek syntax. If you get the identity of Jesus wrong, the entire framework of Orthodox salvation basically collapses. An angelic created Jesus is simply not an infinite savior. A created being cannot pay an infinite price for humanity's sins on the cross. Orthodox theology strictly requires a savior who is truly God. Plus, whether Jesus is the creator or a creation directly impacts the divine authority behind every single one of his actions and teachings here on earth. As we look ahead to future discussions regarding the specific divine authorities Jesus claimed on earth, like, the right to forgive sins, we're left with a pretty fascinating question to ponder. How deeply do these modern translation choices and debates over a single ancient Greek word like Prototokos ultimately shape the theology and the spiritual worldview of millions of people across the globe today? It's a really powerful reminder that when we study historical texts, every single word truly matters.